The year of 2021, my company, Sparkbox, took an engagement with a very large financial services firm. They had lots of ideas for new products. They were operating in a very competitive market, and we were kind of excited. They wanted us to come in, sit alongside their team, help them develop one of these new ideas into a product, and at the same time, build a design system. And I think their hope was that over time, we'd be able to develop that system into something their team could use to execute much more quickly on all the other ideas they had for products. Very exciting, sounded like something that fit right into what we would love to do. And so we jumped in for most of 2021. And I wish that I could stand here and tell you an amazing success story about this project, about this engagement. But at the end of that year, we had struggled so hard with this work that we actually sat down with the leadership team and chose to walk away from the engagement. And the reason that we gave to our client at the time was cultural incompatibility. And I don't think I fully understood what I meant in that moment when I used this phrase, but it didn't sit well with me. And so I spent that holiday season kind of at the end of 2021 just ruminating on this and feeling honestly pretty frustrated with myself that we got to this point. And I think I wanted to do some work to understand why it happened, but also how do I keep something like that from happening again in the future. And so I, this year, have spent a lot of time diving into this idea of culture. And that had never happened in our 14-year history. And so I really wanted to focus on this and understand what was going on. So before I dive into all of the research and things that I've shared, I want you just to have some information to connect with me on Twitter. Also, I've made this little form for you if you have questions or if you have feedback on this presentation or if you have ideas or anything. I would love that from you, so feel free to fill that out. You can just say hello if you'd rather. And none of the stuff that I share with you here today would be possible without the amazing and very kind people that I get to work with every day at Sparkbox, and you can see their smiling faces at sparkbox.com. So I want to share with you two frameworks that I discovered just in doing research on culture. And then I'll make sure that we connect that back to the work we're doing with systems. The first framework I want to share was developed by a guy named Edgar Sheen. He's a social scientist in the US and college professor. And he offers a really simple model that we can use to talk simply about organizational culture. He said that culture is made up of 3 layers. And he defines them in this pyramid shape. He says, the first is our basic underlying assumptions. The second is our espoused beliefs. And the third are the artifacts of the culture. So artifacts means the things that you see, the visible perks, right? You walk into the office, there's a ping pong table. That's an artifact of the culture, correct? Maybe they buy you lunch on Fridays. So those are the things you see, the things that you observe. The espoused beliefs are the things that people say. So the company mission, the vision, the things that we talk about in our conversations in Slack and in person and in email. Perhaps the slogan that's mounted on the wall when you first walk into the office, if you have an office. And then the basic underlying assumptions are what people actually believe. These are much harder to determine, much harder to figure out. And they're usually revealed by the actions that people take in a really difficult time. So it's the tough seasons where these things kind of rise to the surface. Now, as an employee of an organization, you experience these things from the top down. So on your first day at a new company, you're going to observe what's happening around you. Right? You'll see lots of things. And eventually, you'll have some conversations with folks, and you'll hear what they say about the company. And then at some point, your leaders or your peers will be faced with something difficult. And that's when you'll have an opportunity to learn what they truly believe. Now, when these things don't line up, we call it a weak culture. And weak cultures often have an excessive amount of policies and procedures, and those are in place to try and keep people constrained in some set of behaviors. And when these things line up, We call it a strong culture. And strong cultures means you don't need to be as explicit about the behaviors you expect from folks because people are aligned on what they believe. So this alignment helps tremendously in building an organization where people trust each other, where people feel like they belong. And I know that I have not yet said a word about design systems. I promise you we're getting there, but I needed to give you this so that we had a common language to talk about culture, all right? So the second framework that I want to share with you was developed by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn in the late 90s, and it's called the Competing Values Framework. Now, in this framework, there are 4 primary types of organizational culture, and they call it the Competing Values Framework because the x-axis and the y-axis are 2 spectrums of competing values. So along our y-axis, we go from flexible to focused. Flexible meaning a dynamic and adaptive culture. These cultures have a willingness to change. And focused meaning stable and ordered cultures. And these cultures have confidence to stay true to their founding ideals. Along the x-axis, we're spanning from an internal orientation to an external orientation. Internal meaning that these organizations make decisions based on the factors that originate inside the organization, like perhaps the concerns of their employees. And an external organization makes decisions that are based on factors outside of the organization, things like the economy or perhaps their competition. Now, most organizations are going to have some part of each of these quadrants as a part of their culture. But this does give us a nice lens through which to observe what's happening inside of our companies, inside of our organizations. So let's briefly take a quick look at each of these quadrants. So our top left is where we're joining flexibility and an internal orientation. And this we call a collaborative or clan culture. This is where the people have an eye toward long-term development, cohesion, morale, support, and they like to do things together. You could think of service companies perhaps operating often in this quadrant. This is where my company, Sparkbox, lives. This is the quadrant that I am always in. Next, in the bottom left, we're joining focus with an internal orientation, and this is control or hierarchy culture. And this is where progress is incremental. There's a respect for hierarchy, for value being placed on stability and predictability. And here, we talk about doing things right. So oftentimes you'll see financial or banking or healthcare institutions in this quadrant. Now, I just want to pause here very quickly and call something out because I think a lot of us might look at these 2 words, collaboration, control, and think collaboration is good and control is bad. But I just want you to hear that neither of these are good, neither of these are bad inherently. There are good and bad versions of all of these, okay? So don't think that control just means bad or negative, all right? Got to use some kind of words here to define these. So really what we're describing is the tendencies for the culture. So moving on, in that top right, we're joining flexibility with an external orientation. And this is a creative or adhocracy culture. I had to go look up what adhocracy means, and it just means the opposite of bureaucracy. So anything goes is kind of the way to think about it. This is where new ideas can really break through. There's flexibility and creativity and disruption and entrepreneurship. Those are the things we reward. And there's a lot of value here placed on doing things first. So oftentimes, this is where a startup or a scale-up organization kind of begins. Now finally, in that bottom right, we're joining focus with an external orientation. And this is a competitive or market culture. And here there's an eye towards short-term performance. Acquisition is a major strategy for growth, and individuals are rewarded for doing things fast. So these are the companies that are perhaps buying their competition in order to put them out of business, right? Now, I want to just add to this some, what I'll just call additional sentiments, and that's because I've been interviewing folks about these ideas for basically all of this year. And I've been just taking a bunch of notes. And here's the kinds of phrases that I hear people say when they kind of identify their organization as being in one of these quadrants. In that collaborative quadrant, I hear people say, people first. In the controlling, I hear them talk about avoiding risk. In that creative, they're talking about disrupting things. And in the competitive, they're always focused on the competition, beating the competition. So now, just a brief moment here. I'd love for you to imagine that I have your CEO or your president or your leadership on stage with me here. And I turn to this person and I ask, which quadrant does your organization primarily fall into? So I'm asking your leadership this question. And I would love for you to, by show of hands or perhaps in the chat, let us know, do you feel that your organization is collaborative, the organization as a whole? Okay, good. And how many of you would say controlling, control, hierarchy? A few? Okay. And how about creative, adhocracy, anything goes? Not so many, all right. And then how about competitive or market culture? Yeah. Okay, we actually have a pretty reasonable balance here. That's interesting. So I want to also say this, that culture is formed any place where people are getting together consistently. So of course, your organization as a whole has a culture. But your specific product teams all will have their own subcultures. Your group of folks who get together to discuss a book over lunch have their own little subculture. So our organizations are made up of many, many cultures. And if you have a design system practice, that program has its own subculture. So for the past 4 months, the interviews that I've been doing with design system leaders, I've identified that there are really 2 of these subcultures that are most common in the design system world. And those are the ones that fall on the left side of this diagram. And that's because the left side is an internal orientation. And most often, design systems are kind of internally focused. So these system teams, these systems cultures are most often collaborative or controlling. So the first type here, falling in the top left quadrant, is that collaborative version. And this is, we know they value doing things together. We know they're focused on the long-term success. And I hear them say things kind of like this. I believe the scope of my work cannot be accomplished in any other way than to partner with teams who have caught this vision. So this cross-team collaboration means they're building systems that are enabling instead of restrictive. Now, the other primary type found in that bottom left is a controlling culture. And this, we know that they value doing things right. They're focused on incremental improvement over time. These are often driven by inconsistency in the products. And I hear them say something along these lines. My product teams haven't created consistency, so I'm here to make sure they do. Now, neither of these, again, is right or wrong. They're just very different perspectives on how to approach the work. And I have identified that there are healthy characteristics about each of these, and there are also some unhealthy characteristics. It's helpful to think about them on a spectrum, to remember that there is a range of health, but also that towards the extreme ends of this spectrum is where we start to reach unhealthy territory. So let's take a look at a few characteristics that fall into the healthy part of this spectrum. In the collaborative, healthy culture, prioritization of features is often based on the subscriber needs. Because they're collaboratively minded, they're doing the work to get out and understand what the folks need on these product teams. And you can contrast that with a more controlling, healthy design system culture, and you'll see that the prioritization here oftentimes is driven by the needs of an organization. So they're thinking about it more from a top-down perspective. What's funny is that you'll often find that the work isn't that different. It's just the approach that they come to the prioritization exercise with that's a little bit unique. Adoption in a healthy, collaborative, systematic culture is primarily driven by relationship, right? We get to know the folks, we want to become subscribers, and we work with them, we collaborate with them, we build a relationship with them. In the controlling, healthy, systematic practice, adoption is primarily driven by incentive. So this could be things like understanding what these teams value, could be talking about OKRs or KPIs or however you measure that stuff, working with their directors, their leadership to understand how to incentivize them to adopt. I had one really fun story from a gentleman who was operating in this way, and he was really struggling to get engineers to adopt the system. So he actually started to just go to lunch with them and not say anything, but listen. And what he learned is that they all just kept talking about how they really wanted to do open source work. He didn't say a word to them, but he went back to his boss and said, hey, how would you feel if we open sourced the design system? His boss was like, yeah, go for it. And so he open sourced the system, and 2 weeks later, he had people knocking on his door, sending him notes saying they wanted to be involved in the project. And all he did was understand what would incentivize them, right? Very simple. So just a simple example of how to drive with incentive. Another healthy characteristic of a collaborative, systematic culture is this idea of intentional flexibility. So when that system doesn't do everything that somebody needs it to, there is a process in place. There's encouragement to go ahead and extend it in some way that's needed. There's a process, there's a flow, there's thought into that. And you can contrast that with a healthy controlling system where they are necessarily restrictive. In this model, there's an encouragement more to use what we have and discouraging the idea of extending the system. And then the last is about sort of how change management or workflow adaptation happens. And in that healthy collaboration, the system team is thinking about how do we adapt to the workflows of our subscribers. So they're understanding the flows that are already in place with product teams and trying to fit into those models. And in the controlling healthy systematic practice, it's more about understanding that those subscribers will have to do a little bit more adapting to the approach the system is taking. So again, this is not everything, of course. There's lots of other characteristics we can identify, but these are 4 main ones that I've kind of observed. And I want to share just a few as well that are unhealthy characteristics. So an unhealthy collaborative culture, there's a tendency to try and prioritize everything. And of course, doing that means we're going to serve nobody well, right? The controlling model, we tend to just completely ignore subscriber needs. And in this way, we're serving nobody well. So again, these are the extreme ends, right, out on the spectrum between collaboration and control. There's an unsustainable over-support through the adoption process with a collaborative team. These are the folks that are coming in and actually doing the adoption work for the subscriber team. That kind of behavior, I've heard stories about great success in that, but it's also something to be very careful with because every interaction you have with a subscriber is teaching them how you expect to be interacted with. So if you're setting it up so that you are going to be the one that does the work for them, you're also setting up some patterns of behavior that probably are not the healthiest. And then on the controlling side there, an unhealthy characteristic is an unsustainable lack of support through the adoption process. So teams are just left to figure it out on their own. There's a scenario with the idea of extension in an unhealthy collaborative culture where there's just extreme flexibility. Basically, the extension is overused, right? I see some nodding heads. Maybe this is something you've struggled with where we encourage extension, but there has to be some limit on that, right? And so sometimes we get a little too far on that extreme. We can see that really being overused. And then the opposite in the controlling where there's extreme restriction, right? Extension of the system is completely forbidden. And then finally, in an unhealthy collaborative culture, there's this idea of extreme accommodation for the subscriber needs, the subscriber workflows. Again, this results in sort of a decision paralysis. We're just trying to prioritize everybody and a lack of accommodation for those workflows in the controlling model. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this next slide, but I'm putting it up here if you want to take a picture or a screenshot. This kind of just lays them all out on one screen and helps you to see, to remind you that this is a spectrum and these are the extreme ends where we start to run into problems. So, something to keep in mind. Now, the competing values framework gives us a nice overview of the kinds of organizational cultures that we can expect to see. What's really interesting about it to me is that some of these cultures are actually incompatible. So the way this works is that cultures which are diagonal from each other are like oil and water. They do not work well together. So as an example, if your organization as a whole is creative, right? You're entrepreneurial, you're thinking about doing things first, then it's going to be very difficult for you to create a systematic practice that is controlling. Okay, these two don't go together. In fact, I was doing an interview with a woman discussing this a little bit, and she shared this story with me. She worked for a large design system that was part of a web-based product, I'll say. And she gave me this story. She said that when she began at the organization, they were definitely in startup mode. So in that top right kind of very creative space. They recognized their product interfaces were very inconsistent. And so they felt that a design system was maybe the way to go about creating consistency across their products. So the system that they built was very limiting, right? They created a systematic practice in that bottom left controlling culture. Their hope was to kind of force these product teams to use the same components and therefore would have a result of a very consistent set of products. But it turned out that that startup mindset from that creative culture, that mindset is what was causing inconsistency. There were pivots in the product looking for a market fit. And when they offered a design system to the product teams that was really limiting, it didn't give their teams the flexibility they needed to respond to those pivots coming from leadership. And so those teams simply started to build without the system, right? So what she was describing to me was this scenario, right? And we didn't have the language at the time, but when I look at that now, it's interesting to me. And here's how she ended the conversation. She said, "We should have recognized the need for flexibility in this system as a way of supporting the necessary pivots the company was taking to find our place in the market. That would have built trust with our subscribers as an enabling tool instead of a restrictive one." What she was describing was this, right? We should have been more intentional in creating a collaborative, systematic practice. Now, on the opposite diagonal, we have the same exact problems. So if your company is competitive, sort of in this do things fast kind of culture, then it'll be very difficult for your design system program to succeed if you're trying to do that as a collaborative, systematic practice. In fact, if you will recall that story I opened with, this idea of an organization we were working with who we chose to walk away from. After doing some of this research, this, I think, is what we were trying to do. You know, me as an individual, I live in that top left quadrant. That's the company that I've tried to build. And we were trying to create a very collaborative process inside of an organization that was wildly competitive. And that just didn't work. So my takeaway from that, for me at least, was I need to do the work to understand the cultures that we're working inside, and we can do better to adapt. In fact, we probably could have been more successful if we had operated on the bottom of this diagram. This sort of compatibility is nice because it makes you feel like you're swimming with the current instead of against it. Now, I'm continuing to do research here, and so I have asked my team to create for you all a simple survey. This is this URL will take you there. And I'm sorry, I'm going to grab myself a glass of water. So this survey will help me to continue to gather information around this stuff because I feel like there's still a lot to learn here. So it will take you some time. It will take you about 20 or 30 minutes, which I know is a lot for a survey. So I'm kind of making a commitment to you that if you will give me 30 minutes, I will also give you 30 minutes. So if you'll take a few minutes to fill this out, there's an option at the end of this survey where I will find 30 minutes to sit down and explain the results to you. If that's not something you're interested in, you can also just hold off, and I will make sure I publish any information that we learn from this. So it would mean a lot to me if you'd take a few minutes to do this. I think it would be really helpful for me, and I will happily share that information back. Now, anytime I talk about this stuff, I always get this question. Can the system subculture change the culture of the organization? I really want this to be the case, believe me. I'm a pretty positive guy, as Jeremy kind of indicated, and I want this kind of change to be possible. And I have seen some really healthy, very mature design systems have a really good impact on the culture of their design program. But it's really hard and really slow work. And that comes back actually to this diagram. You'll recall that we experience culture from the top down. But you can't create culture in that way, right? You've seen organizations try to do this. There's problems with the culture, so they buy the ping pong table, right? That artifact is not going to change your culture. Instead, culture is created from the bottom up. And you do this by identifying the underlying assumptions that are shared across your team. You look for that overlap. And that overlap of underlying assumptions become your common values. And when you can find unity across the individual's basic underlying assumptions, the other two layers become a natural outpouring of those beliefs. With this cultural alignment, the things that we say and the things that we see are simply a reflection of the things we believe. So I'll close with one simple idea. Your design system will not make your products more consistent. Think about this, right? I could take any of your design systems, I could sit down, and I could make the most awful experience with them, right? The hard truth is that people will make what they want to make. And the critical word in this statement is the word want. So if consistency or cohesion or whatever you want to call it is your goal, the only sustainable way to get that change is to change what your subscribers want to do. You do that with culture. You don't do that with pixels. You don't do that with React. You don't do it with code or documentation or Figma or React. And your design system can be a catalyst for this kind of change, but it will not do it on its own. This is the unspoken and deeply challenging mandate of a design system team. This is your job. I hope that some of these ideas that I've shared with you today will help you to do that job a little bit better tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening.
Have a seat. Thank you very much, Ben.
My pleasure.
Thoughtful as always. When you were showing the initial diagram of, the basic underlying assumptions, then what you actually say, it reminded me of a quote by one Joe Biden. I don't know if you know him. He was vice president of the United States of America when he said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." Which is a great quote, except I'm now thinking about Natalie's talk earlier today. It's also a very kind of a capitalist approach to things. Do all organizations in a capitalist system automatically share capitalist values?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't think that they do. There's structures coming into place now for organizations that are much more altruistic, different types of corporations, in fact, with different tax structures and all that. So I do believe there are some examples of organizations, Patagonia is the one everybody thinks about, but they have a bigger vision that is less about capitalism, despite the fact that they do tend to be very successful financially. So you could argue, is that a chicken or an egg, right? Are they successful because they care about things bigger than money, or are they able to be someone who cares about those things because they're successful? I don't know.
So you think there can be ethical culture under capitalism?
I have to believe there can be. Otherwise, I'm out.
So I saw a lot of people nodding in recognition, I think, to the different quadrants. And I was certainly, like you, I was in that collaborative thing, which, like you say, it sounds great. Right? At Clear Left, one of the things we're always going on about is autonomy. People at Clear Left, we really value autonomy. It's what we say. Hopefully, it's what we really do. That's really bitten us on the ass sometimes. When someone new joins, maybe they've been used to a different culture, and they say, "Tell me what to do," and we're like, "No, you're the designer. We trust you completely. You do it." And there's a real mismatch. Is this sounding familiar to you?
Yeah, I think there's it's about understanding what individuals need too. Like each of you could look at those quadrants and you could think about your organization and where that organization fits, but you could also think, where do I personally fit, right? So we all, and when if you spend some time and take that survey, you'll see how you could sort of align with some of these statements. And so, there's a tension there for sure. I did a workshop about this not too long ago, and some of the folks, I think, had some sort of personal challenging moments when they realize the organization that they work in does not align. It was diagonal from their personal set of values. And I think a tool like that can be really powerful to help you understand, are you in the right place? So that's maybe what I would say if people are struggling with that. Find a place where you align,
Yeah, I wanted to dive into that, I guess, difference between what the individual, where the individual would be on that diagram versus the organization they're in. Like, ultimately, is that the source of burnout? When an individual is burnout, does it come down to the fact that they're struggling against the stream, they're struggling against the tide, and they take it on themselves, they blame themselves, but actually, it's the system.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a part of it. Dan Donald from Zero Height and I just did a little online event called Design System Triage, and we had all these folks get on, and I was reminded of what I'm seeing happening in the Slack group for the design system team of one. There was like this hunger just to connect with other people that cared about the same things, and I think this is lonely work. I mean, it's there. Like we've seen, there are some big teams, and you can read about their stories, but there are oftentimes it's very few folks inside of an organization, one or two. They're on their own. And their job is to, sort of like interact with every other team, but that's lonely because they don't have their own team, So I have like a tender heart towards those folks. I want to try to figure out how do we create, and the work Gina's doing here with Clarity and the community here is a big source of I think, help in that situation. But these kinds of events where we can recognize we do have a community, it's just a little bit different, right? It's outside of our organization. Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult stuff. It definitely could lead to burnout.
Yeah, I'm taking like your kind of question there. Can the design system subculture, infect the organizational culture? I guess that at the level of the individual, you could ask the same. Could a very collaborative person infect the culture of? And I guess the answer is going to be the same, which is probably not.
Yeah, I mean the book that comes from. I mentioned the authors. Robert Quinn and that group, the whole point of that book is about changing culture. So they've got it's a long book. There's a lot of details in there, and they talk through different processes around how to actually do that. But it is years long work. It's not a simple thing to do, and it does require, like infecting, for lack of a better word, like every individual, especially in leadership where there's sort of more authority to kind of state what those things are,
So if there's somebody recognizing a mismatch, maybe they've just seen your talk and they're thinking, me personally, I'm in one quadrant and my organization is in a different quadrant. What's your advice to them?
I mean, if you personally are operating in a scenario where you're diagonally, with the organization, I would probably say to look for another job personally.
Yeah.
Because you as an individual, you're gonna have a really hard time changing that. But if your design system culture is diagonal from the organization's culture, that's where I feel like we can adjust, right? I think an example might be contribution. We talk about contribution models. Contribution, by definition, is a collaborative type of mindset, right? We're gonna work together. I'm gonna take the work you've done and integrate it back into the work I'm doing. So I feel like if we could think about there being more than one model for contribution, one that is highly collaborative, right? If you're trying to operate with teams that are very collaborative, and we come alongside you, we do the work together, we figure it out, we make this stuff work, or one that's more on that controlling side, where we say, hey, here's the process to follow. You do your part of it, and then we'll take it from there, and we'll make sure that it's been refactored appropriately for the use of a more systematic approach. So those are two very different models of contribution, but one is operating in more of a collaborative cultural mindset. One's operating in more of a controlling. So I think it's possible to shift the way we work, and it's not. I made it seem simple here, but a design system team is operating with many product teams, and each of those product teams will have their own subculture. So it may be a lot more nuanced, right? Like when I'm working with this team, I need to think this way. When I'm working with this team, I have to think this way. So it kind of requires a little bit of that switching of mentalities. It's
politics and compromise and networking, all that stuff.
Yeah, all that.
Maybe this is kind of a controversial thing to say then. Could it be actively harmful when we, we go to events and hear a case study about a particular design system at a particular company, or we read something online and think, oh man, that sounds great, I'm going to do what they did, but without taking into consideration whether your organization is coming from the same cultural place.
Yes, that's such a good observation. And I feel like that is a theme that we've heard over the last day and a half here, which is that you have to understand what your team needs, what your company needs. And that's why I actually feel like this cultural stuff is so important. You know, digging in to do the work to understand what does our leadership expect of us, and then how do we operate in a way that's not, you know, swimming upstream to that. I just think that it's probably a way to avoid the burnout. It's probably a way to just have a little bit more peace in your work. Yeah, I think it's a good observation.
Well, I think you nailed the source of one of the biggest woes I hear from people with design systems is adoption. We've got this great design system. Does this resonate with anybody? Oh, why won't they adopt it? It's so good. I think you've nailed it, which is there's a mismatch. It's like the culture of the design system is mismatched to the culture of the people who have to actually use it. So it sounds from what you're saying is the design system culture needs to adapt to the other culture.
I just think that's more realistic. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen a way to do it in the opposite, where you're asking the organization's culture to change. I think that's probably something over years and earning the right to kind of have a say in that way. So it's making a decision. Are you willing to adapt? You know, perhaps that that bottom left quadrant that's a little bit more controlling is a more uncomfortable space for you personally, but it's going to help you to actually get more work done, you know, and serve the organization better.
You were talking about how it takes a long time to change a culture. I couldn't help but think of like the whole pace layers model, you know, where you've got like culture takes a long time. And then you got things like the principles, the kind of thing that Linda was talking about. They change, but they don't change that often. And then finally you've got the actual components, the patterns, the icons, stuff like, oh yeah, they'll be changed next week, it seems to me. And yeah, I know I'm going to sound like a dog with a bone again, Lingotis, but it does seem like we focus way too much on that top layer.
We definitely do. Yeah, I think you asked something similar to another speaker, and they were just like, yes. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think most of the work here, it's not technical. It's not I mean, y'all are smart. You can solve all the technical problems. I had no worries about that. You know, it's the people stuff that's hard, right? It's the culture, it's the politics, it's all of that. So yeah, I would say 75% of your time probably is what I would be spending on that stuff.
which goes back to what Valerie was talking about, the framing of it as the human skills.
That's right.
Yeah, that's where we need to be spending our time, I guess. Damn, we're in complete agreement. I was hoping that we'd be having a good argument here. He's too damn nice. All right, I'm just gonna cut it short because this is no good. We're all in complete agreement, and we've solved design systems. Damn it. I'm going to hand over to Sam in a minute. Before I do, please give it up for Ben Callahan.
Thank you all.